I'm going to call up Brian Callam is going to call up his panel. So we're going to continue that discussion of unusual mortality events. So Brian, I'll hand this over to you. Let's see. You want this? You want to go wireless?
Yeah. Is there another one?
Yes. Yes, there is. And I should have mentioned it's unusual oyster mortality events. So.
Answering questions.
I'm going to talk about what a deleterious allele is while we're waiting.
So I mentioned.
I was into those in my 20s.
Yeah. These genes, these forms of genes that the oysters have that are suboptimal by virtue of some mutation. You know, when the geneticists is thinking about this genetic load, they think about these lethal recessives, you know, these copies of the genes, these forms of the genes that will have this mutation that will cause them to be lethal, for example, when they're in the homozygous condition. And these are scattered throughout the genome of everything, but especially in bivalves more than anything else. There are more of these lethal recessives and bad alleles.
Okay, so obviously we're going to continue the discussion here, and hopefully it will be a discussion, so we want to have a lot of input from you all on mortality in oysters. We saw some great presentations this morning getting us thinking about mostly triploid mortality, but also some pest issues with the boring sponge. So, you know, we saw a lot of hands go up with the boring sponge issue. Who here has seen oysters die on their farm, right? Yeah, everybody, right? So we're talking here about unusual mortality. So what exactly is unusual mortality, and how might you differentiate that from regular expected mortality? So I guess this first question I'll kick to Bob, since he interacts with a lot of growers across a lot of different regions. Is there a normal, usual mortality that a farmer experiences? Is that regional? Is it, you know, is there a normal mortality, and what would that look like?
Yes, oysters die. Most growers are lucky to get 50% from small seed to market. And my experience was difference between a good growing year and a bad growing year was 40 to 60%. A lot of growers won't admit that. I've talked to hundreds of growers, say, what's your mortality rate? Oh, I get 75% through. And so, yeah, you bought 2 million seed and you sold 500,000, so that's not real. They won't admit that they have mass mortalities. Oysters die. This is just, everything likes to eat them. We are finding that floating gear has tremendously improved survival, but bottom cages are not a great way to grow oysters compared to floating gear. If I had ever experienced 10% mortality, I'd be a much richer man than I am now. But no, what is unusual mortality? Unusual mortality is when you pull up the bag and it stinks. When you pull up the bag and you shake it and it sounds like a bunch of jingle shells. But if you're seeing, 5% tending cycle, that's just normal. Part of the problem is that, they may die in the winter, but they don't really rot out until spring. And so you're not really aware that there's a bunch of dead ones in the bag until they actually rot out. The bacteria eat them and warm up. When you pick up that bag and it stinks, that's time to, And then I was talking to somebody about, why would I send a sample into a pathologist and find out what's killing my oysters? They can't fix the problem. There's no drug we can give them. Well, because we need to know what's killing our oysters, so that would be good to find out, you know. But I lost my entire crop my first year in the black, and that was an eye-opener. And I sent, because I'm a scientist, I sent it out to all the pathologists on the East Coast, and they couldn't tell me what killed them. So there are unknown causes of mortality as well. And then there's things like hypoxia events, and of course they don't like growing in fresh water. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, that was good. I did get a little bit ahead of ourselves with all the deleterious allele talk in the beginning. So if you guys would quickly just introduce yourselves and what's your relevancy with oyster mortality here?
My name is Boris Guerrero. We have Southern Bell oysters. We have unusual but not so event because it was a very big freshwater event last year. Mississippi River was very high, and that trickled down all the way to us, which we're about 40 miles west to the Mississippi Delta, and we saw a very high mortality event.
I'm Ryan Carnegie. I'm a shellfish pathologist at the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, and we're very interested in understanding the forces acting on these populations in terms of disease, pressure, and parasitism, and so on. And we're very interested in understanding, you know, what is normal mortality and what is not, and when something is registering as not normal, being involved in working with you to try to understand what it is, so we can try to solve these challenges.
I'm Garrett Kruger. I'm the farm manager for Boondocks Oyster Company down in Panacea, Florida. And we have kind of unusual mortality in the summer times with most of the farmers over in Franklin and Wakulla County. And we've had a couple town hall meetings to try to get to the root of it. And hopefully we can share some insight with what we learned from those meetings.
Okay. So, you know, we have these unusual mortality events, and they're unusual because we don't expect them, and oftentimes we have no idea what's causing them. So when we suspect that we're experiencing one of these things, what should we do? Bob mentioned possibly sending samples off to a pathologist. So Ryan, as a pathologist, what can a grower do? And what can they send things, who to send things to, and at what stage is it useless to send you?
So like I just said in my introduction, like we want to know when you are experiencing something that you register as not normal. We want to hear about that because our first primary concern is whether there might be an emerging disease that we need to control in some way. You know, like the emergence of some virus, something exotic that would warrant, you know, some level of intervention. You know, something that emerges at one farm in Virginia, you know, if it's uncontrolled, could rapidly spread up and down the East Coast, for example. So that's sort of our primary concern is relying on partnership with industry to provide the passive surveillance, surveillance that we do through you of what's going on in terms of emerging diseases, so that we know that, all right, you know, we've got MSX, we've got dermo, we know what we have, and we deal with it through breeding and husbandry and so on, but there's nothing else popping up. When you do register something that strikes you as unusual in the hatchery or the nursery or out in the field, you know, talk to your extension agent right away. Talk to a pathologist and get us a sample. And Tal Ben-Hareen, could you stand up, Tal, for a sec? So Tal is another shellfish pathologist that was just hired recently by NC State University, working in the region. Get us a sample. And in terms of what's useful, you know, sending us a fresh sample, you know, cool, not frozen, something that's alive but cold that we could do microscopic analyses on to see what's going on. If it's too rotten and, you know, I mean, dead oysters don't always tell tales, but sometimes they do, and we do get information sometimes out of even something that's pretty far gone. So yeah, anything that you can collect from an event, pack it pretty well. But yeah, talk to an extension agent or one of the pathologists in the region and get us a sample.
So you would recommend sending something is always better than sending nothing.
Sending something is better than sending nothing, right? Yeah.
Okay, so I'll put this to the entire panel here, mostly focusing on the growers. What types of things are you guys doing on the farm to pay attention to this? Obviously, if you pull up a cage or a bag and you shake it or roll it around and it's just a jingle of open dead shells, that's pretty clear and obvious. But sometimes, you know, the mortality might be a little bit more gradual, not quite as extreme, and could still potentially be unusual. So is there anything that you're doing to differentiate out the normal mortality that you might expect on your farm to be able to notice as it's starting to get higher and higher?
I think one of the things that we do is we try to keep a count with every cage. We kind of say, you know, we kind of call it like how many dead we throw out, and as we run through the sorters, and we're constantly saying, okay, well, oh, that was weird. This one cage was 10, the next cage was 25. Oh, okay, and you kind of keep it in your head like, okay, well, what's going on here? And you just kind of keep running through them, and you know, it's 10, 15, 12, oh, 27. Well, okay, well, what could be the difference here? And so far, we haven't been able to pinpoint it. Just it looks like mostly in our area, it seems like most of the farmers that experience high mortalities have a higher density in their cages. And, you know, it's hard for them to really pinpoint it because I don't think they work their cages as often as we do. We touch every oyster once a month. And I think some of the farmers are more like, I don't know, once every 2 or 3 months. So by the time you get back to a cage, I mean, there could have been a lot that's happened between the time you put those oysters in, and they have no idea on going back, and they don't really keep very good records.
Yeah, same thing. We keep track of live and dead oysters, and I think that's the best way to doing it and figure out, because you could be doing something wrong. Like if you flip a cage in the summertime, you leave it out for all day long, you're definitely going to start seeing some mortality. So you don't want to do that, but definitely keep track of your live oysters and dead oysters.
So as an egghead scientist oyster farmer, I was always doing lots of experiments on everything, and I advise you to try and do this. Stock a cage with bags of different densities and see how they perform. It's, bucketometrics. It doesn't have to be exact science, but you will see a point at which you overstock, and you will see the meat start to get thin and watery. I'm always opening oysters and looking at the amount of meat and how it fills the shell. I'm always looking at that, and I always advise people, keep some pets. Have a bag that is really understocked, that you tend and you change and make sure it never gets fouled up. And if you've got a problem in these pets, then you've got a real problem. That's a disease. That's something that you need. That's an alarm. These pets should be prime. But everybody at one point in their career has overstocked their gear. They've bought more oysters than they have gear for, or they have labor to tend, and they will kill most of their crop. This is the #1 rookie mistake that every grower does. And don't feel bad, because everybody has done it at least once. I encourage you not to. This is part of our problem. We have a seed shortage. If everybody only bought what they could grow and had gear for, that would end our seed shortage. But I'm sorry if I just killed your market.
So record keeping obviously is extremely important to be able to detect things. What about, are there any general husbandry things that everybody should be paying attention to? This is mainly for some of the newer folks in the audience that are really important in minimizing the risk of inducing your own mortalities, so that you're not confusing that with something that is actually unusual that's emerging at your location.
Density, density, density. Keep your densities low. That's the biggest thing we found in local and Franklin counties. And some guys, they say, oh yeah, my densities are low. They're not low. Those floating bags are barely floating, and they're like, oh yeah, they're low. No, they're not low. Yeah, low in the water.
Same thing. I mean, density, and definitely when you're desiccating, you got to be careful that I'm in Louisiana, so I've definitely got to be careful. It's really hot to leave them in in the summer. So when you're working with them, just take care of them, keep them cool, and density.
Yeah, one thing I learned is if you're brine dipping, that vat of brine is typically black and stinky, and if it's in the sun, it'll heat up real hot. And if you take oysters and dip them in real hot water for 10 minutes, you got a lot of dead oysters. But yeah, it's all about the density. Most of the flow, everything is flow. They need to have flow to bring new food to the animals in the bag, otherwise they're starving to death. 90% of the flow goes around the bag. That's a clean bag. And once it gets fouled up, most of the water's not getting to those animals, so they're starving to death. And, you know, go in, shuck them. They will talk to you. You have to open them up to see what they're saying. And when they're thin and watery, either they just spawned out or they're overstocked. And 9 times out of 10, every farm I've done consulting work on, they're overstocking their bags. Density, density, density. Thank you.
So density obviously is important, and we've talked a little bit about biological things like parasites and diseases earlier. What sort of environmental characteristics are important for growers to be monitoring for their locations? I know down where we are, obviously it's salinity, but in different regions there's different concerns. So what are we seeing across, not just in the Oyster South region, but also other places that maybe folks in the southern oyster region should start to be paying attention to?
One thing that caught me off guard early in my career was hypoxia. Come middle of July, August, there's areas of these very rich growing waters that go totally hypoxic at night. All that phytoplankton that is in the water that makes it a wonderful, rich growing area, at night it turns into a respiring organism, sucks out the oxygen and puts out CO2, and my oxygen plummeted to 0 at night. And when I saw that happen in my nursery area, suddenly I started to go from, you know, tripling every week in volume to suddenly barely doubling, and now they're slowing down. And I didn't really see immediate mortalities, but later in the season, I had really hurt myself because I would see mortalities later. So I never dreamed I would have a hypoxia issue in my area. And guess what? I had a hypoxia issue, and I couldn't grow oysters in that area. I had to move them out into places with better flow, more oceanic flow, better oxygen. Come middle of July, probably down here, it's probably earlier in the season. But get an oxygen probe or go borrow one from your extension agent. Go out there at dawn and see how bad it got in, you know, July and August. If it's real bad, guess what? These are animals, they need to breathe. If there's no oxygen, they're suffering. An adult oyster can handle low oxygen for quite some time. Seed, not so much.
So I'm sure we have a lot of questions, especially from the presentations that we saw earlier. So at this point, I want to open it up and solicit some input from the audience.
The question is, what is the ideal stocking density?
Depends on the bag, depends on the cage, depends on your farm. I think you said it best, like, stock your bags at different densities and find out what works for your farm. It took us a lot of trial and error. I think we're on year 3, and I think we have just now dialed it in. And even then, sometimes I wonder if maybe we can even go lighter. And we're going really light in the SEPA cage. I think we put 1/4 gallon in a SEPA cage, and which equates to market size oysters, maybe 30 or 40 oysters in that SEPA cage. But that's what works for us. So you're just going to have to, it's all trial and error, I think, at this point. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. It also depends how fast you want to work. So if you want to stock them a little bit higher, you got to be faster.
Yeah, it's trial and error. The smaller animals, they got a higher metabolism rate, so you can't put as many in a bag as you can, say, something that's approaching market size. But even on the same lease, I had an area where it was shallow and the water would move faster. I could stock those cages heavier. But always do the experiment. And, you know, different times of year, different genetic strains, different crops, different sizes of animals are going to have a different ideal stocking density. And you got to find out what that is for your farm, because it depends on your flow your gear, how good you are at the husbandry and the cleaning, and what food is in the water. And then occasionally you'll get bad phytoplankton, and it doesn't matter how much food and flow they get, everybody stops feeding and they're all starving.
And Skid, I'd add to that, because I think you pointed this out to me. The first way to tell before mortality, if you've got too many oysters in a bag, you're going to see that there are winners and losers in that bag. You're going to see the variation increase. You're going to get small oysters and you're going to get large oysters. It's going to be a pretty big spread when you pour them out, because that shows that they're competing in that bag and somebody's losing and somebody's winning. So you don't have to wait for oysters to die to see that you're overstocking. You should be able to see some of that in the shapes of the oysters that are coming out. Any other questions for these guys? I thought I saw a couple hands.
So one thing that I'm sure you were thinking but didn't mention, and I know a lot of folks know, is, yeah, if you can, a lot of people that we work with in the field, I'm not a grower, I'm an academic, but a lot of folks really are not measuring water quality on a regular basis, or they're reliant on local resources for water quality that either does continuous or point monitoring. So when you're measuring oxygen, as was mentioned, that's really important to be able to do that on your own, but you can't do it at noon. You got to get out there at the very start of the day, because you'll miss the smoking gun, right? Oxygen will go up during the day. Everybody's dead. You could have had hypoxia. But how many people actually measure water quality on their sites on a regular basis? So that's really great. It's a very small number, and I just want to support that doing that. Once you get good at it, you can do it pretty inexpensively. I know that your minutes are very, very valuable, but maybe you have a thought on ways of integrating some kind of farm-specific or region-specific little program that people can put together that will have more monitoring to get those smoking guns, because getting samples without water quality data is less of a sample as well.
I don't want to push back on that, but there's not much you can do except move your farm. So, I got decades of data and temperature data, and it's like, okay, great, I can't influence the temperature. The only thing I could do is, when I found I had a low oxygen problem, and move my animals to a different lease. That's really the only tool in the box. You can't typically affect water quality. So it's nice to know what's going on, but personally, I didn't know what to do with these mountains of data, because I am an egghead farmer, and I measured everything. And I was like, great, okay, now what do I do with it? It doesn't tell me crap.
And I'm going to say this with love, right? And Leslie and I were at a meeting in Wakulla, when we have questions about mortality, growers want to find the cause. They want to point to something that killed their oysters. It's got to be a pathogen. It's got to be because the oxygen went too low. The temperature was too high. My oysters all boiled in the water. And I'm just telling you, oysters are pretty bulletproof. And pathogens do happen. That's why we have trained pathologists you can send to. But I'm telling you, most times it's because stuff is too crowded and people aren't checking stuff. There's something going on. We preach about the importance of biofouling in the region. And we grow oysters in the south, which means we grow oysters fast, but that means all our biofouling grows just as fast, if not faster. And so we see problems pile up on these oysters in a matter of weeks. It's not months, like a couple weeks you'll have a problematic fouling in that bag. And I do think we have to look at what we're doing, and I highly recommend those pets that Skid was talking about. I put out more than one bag. I'd have 3 bags of pets, and I know really low stocking densities of those, and see how they grow. What's their growth rate? What's their survival like? Take care of them, and I bet you more often than not won't see problems in those. So.
We having a kumbaya moment here. First thing, old time, I came to Louisiana in '84, and the first thing I learned from the old time oystermen was beware of the fog. Time and time again, they tell me stories of having boatloads of seed. They tied up at the dock for the night to go plant it the next day, and they were all gaping because it got foggy. So and so that's one of the things we practice at Navy Cove. Don't flip in the fog. First of all, you're not going to dry a damn thing out in the fog anyway, and there's a good chance that you could be experiencing some mortalities because they gaped on you in the fog. So don't flip in the fog. And the second thing is we implemented at Navy Cove is before you flip, taste the water. Because it's all about, Ryan, of course, and we all know this, you're adding stressors. Even when you're air drying, you're adding a stressor. Because that oyster isn't used to being intertidal all the time. like a naturally entitled oyster. So taste the water first. If it's not salty, don't flip. Flip only when you taste the salt. And you can teach a high school kid that. So my 2 bits.
A super non-science guy here, but is there any correlation of a chain reaction in a basket when one mortality? Is there any aspect to a chain reaction?
Yeah, so the rotting animal will, the bacteria rotting that animal will suck the oxygen out, and it will create more of a chain reaction, actually. Yeah.
So we have a comment back here.
I was just going to say that one thing that we've had several farmers notice is that it'll start with one bag, and it'll be like in the middle of their lease, and that bag will, to them it'll say, it'll spread like wildfire across their whole lease. But like I said earlier, some of these farmers, they don't check their oysters every month. They check them once every 2 or 3 months. So it could be a little bit of that as well, just poor husbandry.
I'd just like to add something for the farmers to keep track of. It may seem patently obvious, but it's important to know what you're growing. As more and more lines are available for you, I mean, the big obvious distinction is diploid and triploid, and you'd be surprised how many people, when you ask them what you're growing, they say, well, I bought some seed. But, you know, beyond that, there are now becoming more and more varieties of this, and it may matter a great deal which one you're raising in order to inform you in the next season what maybe not to buy and what to try again, you know, what to try. So that's an important distinction in your crops now as we get more sophisticated about farming and lines and breeds.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. I think that really goes along with just good record keeping in general. You want to know how much seed you're putting out, how many animals you're harvesting, but also, you know, as the panel talked about, what you're seeing dying along the way, and obviously what is dying.
You know, often when you're contacting the hatchery to get some seed, it's not an obvious question to say, well, what spawn was that? So a seed is available, it's triploid or it's diploid, I'll get it, but go a little bit deeper because they know what they're spawning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just emphasize the record keeping piece, because if you ever want to make a claim for NAP insurance or any other insurance, you better have good records. Otherwise, there's no hope. But yes, record keeping, please.
I'm also a fan of asking the spawn date. I don't know if hatchery managers would be opposed to that, but you know, we hear like people tell me how they get oysters to market in 4 months. You know, it turns out they were starting with a one-inch oyster, and I'd like to know a little bit more about when that was spawned. But that helps you. Again, that's a record-keeping thing. So Brian, I want to ask, how many oyster farmers in the room have been farming for 5 years or more? How many have been farming for 7 years or more? How many have been farming for 10 years or more? All right, so I think one thing, you know, one reason we asked Brian to do a panel on unusual mortality is there are a lot of new farmers in the region, and we have to get a sense from each other, and you have to get a sense of what's usual and what's unusual. And I think there is I mean, and I know Skid has said this before, because when you go to teach new growers, there are some training programs that are putting out business models that say it's going to be like 90% survival. And you need to get a better handle on what that's really going to be and what that looks like. You know, it is, early on we had 90% survival with some of our stuff. We wouldn't use that number anymore. That doesn't make sense. But you have to get a handle on that as a farmer, get some years under your belt, because it is easy to make those rookie mistakes. And everyone makes them. It doesn't matter how many times you say don't overstock, you will overstock.
And yeah, I had great survival when I was growing 50,000, and try and scale that to 1 million. You're not going to get the same numbers. And one thing I learned early on is oysters can't read a spreadsheet.
Any other questions for these guys?
I know everybody was, or there were mixed items here, but what does everybody use to measure water quality out on their lease? Like I take a thermometer and a refractometer out there to get what I can, but I don't have 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 for a YSI. So what are people using to do that? What's a hobo temp?
Throw it in your bag, get 2 of them so you can download it every 2 weeks or so, and that gives you a really good idea of what's going on. Yeah.
I noticed there are different types. Like,
Oh.
is there one you recommend?
Well, do we have the so, no, the $50 one for the hobo wear data logger, temp data logger. Now you can buy it with conductivity, but that's much more expensive, $750. Buy a free refractometer, not from China, excuse me, and measure.
So is that Odyssey out of New Zealand that you mentioned? Okay. And we've learned by duplicates, because what you want is you're going to deploy one in the bag. You want to be able to grab that, deploy it one at the same time, and bring the other one down to download the data.
And for about $12 more, you can buy hobo temp bloggers that are Bluetooth, and so you don't even have to physically interact with them. You can just like go up to them and immediately download the data.
Are there any other questions or comments? No. All right, so thanks to the panel. Is there any last parting words that you would like to impart on us?
Density.
Hey, I will also say that there are other people that notice when you're overcrowding your bags too that are not farmers.
Yeah, no, meat quality, it's going to affect your market.
We can tell at the restaurant, y'all.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. So we just got a little